and develop.
The time now, 6 minutes past 10. Merry-go-round, the next...
On average, one hen lays over 250 eggs every year. But modern egg farms have millions of hens producing millions of eggs. This one packing station alone handles over 1 million eggs a day. Every egg, well, nearly every one of these eggs, is going to be food for us. But first of all, the eggs are carefully checked by shining a light through them. And if there's anything wrong with an egg, it's rejected. After being sorted into their various sizes, the good eggs are carefully packed into boxes, ready for delivery. Well, these should keep me going for a very long time. You know, we're quite a nation of egg eaters. Of course, we don't eat the shells. The food's inside, in the white and the yolk. Now, some people like to eat raw eggs. I must say they don't appeal to me. I prefer mine boiled. I'm sure you all have your favorite ways of cooking eggs. An ordinary lemon pie. A delicious lemon meringue pie. For me, it's the meringue part that makes this special. The meringue is made from the white of the egg. There's eggs in here too. Only, of course, you can't see them because they're all mixed up with all the other ingredients. No, I'll leave it till later. You know, in the United Kingdom, one way or another, each of us eats 250 eggs every year. That's 12,000, not yet, million. 12,000 million eggs every year. That's an awful lot of eggs. It's enough, in fact, to fill the inside of this studio hundreds of times over.
This is a cockerel, the male bird with his fine plumage.
And this is the female, the hen. When the birds mate, sperm from the male pass into the female and fertilise one of her eggs. The birds mate every day for a number of days, and about 12 hours after each mating, the hen lays a fertilised egg. Only after mating can the hen lay a fertilised egg, and fertilised eggs are very special. The hen sits on the eggs, keeping them warm for about 21 days. And to find out what happens during those days, we're going to look inside a fertilised egg. The shell is removed very carefully because we mustn't disturb anything inside. Now, what can we see? There, on the surface of the yolk, is a disc. It's that disc which will become a new chick. 3 days later, and lots of changes. There's the embryo, the developing chick. Already its tiny heart is pumping blood through a network of veins and arteries. The blood carries food from the white and the yolk, and the embryo uses the food to grow and develop for 21 days, when it's ready to hatch. It looks a bit messy now, but soon its feathers will dry and fluff out, and it'll be ready to join the other chicks.
Harvest time, and the giant combine harvesters gather yet more food for us to eat. In this case, the harvest is wheat. Every year, millions of tons of wheat ripen in the summer sun. Each wheat plant is grown from a tiny seed. Because the seed is so small, it's very difficult to examine. So we've built a large model. On the outside, there's a thick coat to protect the seed. And inside, it looks something like this. Now, the most important part of the seed is there. It's called the embryo. The embryo eventually grows into the new plant. Now, the rest of the seed is mainly food for the embryo. Now, let's find out why the embryo needs all this food.
Well, it needs the food to grow. And here's something you can do to see how it happens. All you'll need is a glass jar, some blotting paper, some water, and some wheat seeds. First of all, roll the blotting paper up and put it into the jar. The blotting paper has to be kept damp, so pour a little bit of water into the bottom of the jar. And then take one wheat seed and pop it between the blotting paper and the jar, and then leave it in a warm place. Because it takes a few days to grow, we've got some specially speeded up film to show you in 30 seconds what actually happens in 5 days. When the seed is warm and damp, it uses the food store to produce first roots, then a shoot. As the roots and the shoot grow, the food store is being used up. Once the shoot has grown up through the ground and into the light, it makes its own food, some of which is stored inside new seeds, ready for the next harvest.
Now, wheat plants are very good food factories. Let me show you. This is part of a wheat plant just as it grows in the fields. This part is called the ear. Now the food comes from this part in the form of little seeds. There are about 30 of them, and they look like this. Now, only one of those seeds is needed for next year's food plant. That leaves all the rest of them for us to use as food. Now, of course, we don't usually eat wheat seeds in this form. We're more used to it like this. Flour. Flour comes from grinding up the wheat seeds. The seeds can be ground by hand or between two stones. It's a very slow process. To find out how a modern mill works, we went along to the Flour Milling and Baking Research Association in Chorley Wood. Here we are in the milling room of the research laboratory, and this is the machine used for small-scale testing. Now, modern flour mills use much larger machines, but they all work in the same sort of way. Now, here's the important part. Two large metal rollers, each of which has a series of grooves cut into the surface. Now, the gap between the rollers is set so that it's not small enough to completely crush the seed, and not so wide that the seed can fall straight through. And there's something else about the rollers. They spin at different speeds. The seed is dragged into the gap, and because the gap is smaller than the seed is torn apart by the ridges on the rollers. After milling, you can see that the rollers have torn open the outer seed coat, and now we're left with a mixture of hard seed coat and soft white endosperm. Only the endosperm is used in white flour, and so we have to separate it from the seed coat. These are sieves. The number of sieves can vary. We're using just 2 to show you how they work. Now, what have we got? Well, in the top sieve here, we have the seed coats. Well, these stay behind because the pieces are too large to pass through the holes. Everything else falls into the next sieve. Now, the holes in this sieve are much smaller, so most of the material stops here, and only the very finest flour gets through to here. But there's not very much of it. Now, most of the endosperm is here, and there's even some endosperm still attached to the seed coat. To get more white flour from this endosperm, we need to do more milling and more milling. And with each milling, the grooves in the rollers get narrower, and the gap between the rollers gets smaller, until finally we use smooth rollers and a very small gap to produce fine white flour.
Most flour's used in baking, and we're going to look at how to bake bread. As well as flour, we need yeast. This is dried yeast, the sort we use for bread, but it's not ready to use yet. To get it ready, we have to add 15 grams of the yeast and 8 grams of the sugar to 250 millilitres of warm water. Then we stir them all together and leave them in a warm place for about 10 minutes. Because we haven't got time to wait, here's a mixture that I made about 10 minutes ago. The yeast uses up the sugar and produces a gas called carbon dioxide. You can see the little carbon dioxide bubbles that have formed, and later you'll see just how important that carbon dioxide is. Now let's mix the other ingredients. First, flour. You'll need 400 grams. Next, salt. And then 15 grams of fat. Rub the fat into the flour and add the yeast liquid. Then mix them all together. When it's really well mixed, then comes the hard work. You've got to knead the dough for about 10 minutes.
And that's where I come in. I've been kneading my dough for some time now. I started about 10 minutes before Anne, and I'm finished. Now, Anne, before we go any further with yours, I think we should compare the two doughs to see what difference kneading makes.
Well, mine's very sticky, and if I try and pull it apart, it just tears. What about yours?
Well, mine's different. It doesn't stick to my fingers like yours does, and when I try to pull it apart, it stretches. See? Now, that's because during the kneading, part of the flour combines with water to produce a new substance called gluten, and gluten is very stretchy. Now, you can make gluten yourselves. You make a dough from just flour and water, and then knead it for 10 minutes. Then you hold it under the tap and squeeze it, and keep squeezing it. Now, apart from the gluten, everything else in the flour is washed down into the bowl. It's mainly starch. Eventually, all that's left is the gluten. And because gluten stretches and doesn't tear, like chewing gum, it can be blown into bubbles.
And that's where the yeast comes in. I've finished kneading my dough and I've put it into a baking tin. Now, for the yeast to do its work, the dough has to be left in a warm place for an hour. Well, that's rather a long time to wait. So we've got some special film to show you in only 20 seconds what actually happens in 60 minutes. We used a glass dish so that you could see what happens. Inside the dough, the yeast is using up the sugar and making carbon dioxide gas. The gas cannot escape and forms hundreds of tiny bubbles which swell and blow up the dough. Now let's look at the dough before and after the yeast has done its work. Beforehand, a solid dough, but afterwards it's full of bubbles held together by the gluten. It's also very soft and it loses its shape easily.
But the job of the gluten isn't finished yet. That comes about in the next final stage, when the dough is baking in the oven. Now, the oven's been warming up for about 15 minutes, and it's at the right temperature now, 230 degrees C, and that's gas mark 8. And now it'll bake for about 45 minutes. Now, again, since 45 minutes is rather a long time, we've made a special film which will show you in 20 seconds what actually takes place in the 45 minutes baking time. At first, the heat causes the gluten to set and helps to give the loaf its final fixed shape. On the outside, a darker brown crust is formed. Let's see what difference baking makes to the gluten. Now, before baking, the gluten is soft. It easily loses its shape. After baking, the gluten has set, and so the loaf keeps its shape. The bubbles spring back when you squash them. And something else. It's crumbly. In fact, it's a very nice loaf.
Thanks. Yeah, we got it right this time, but you should have seen some of the mistakes we made. But making mistakes can be quite useful. You can learn from them. We decided to test some deliberate mistakes.
Now, all the loaves you're going to see were made from the same ingredients and the same quantities, except that in each case, one thing was changed. This loaf had no yeast.
And the dough for this loaf was left to rise for too long. You can see that the dough's come over the edge of the tin. And also there's a hollow on top here. And when we cut it, you can see that the bubbles in the loaf, instead of all being about the same size, are all different sizes, and some of them are very big. And the dough for this loaf wasn't left to rise long enough, and you can see the great big tear along the side there.
So you can see the difference that changing only one part of the recipe makes. By the way, we thought you'd like to see what pure gluten looks like when it's baked.
And here's a loaf that's baked with no gluten at all.
There's a lot of work you can do after the programme investigating eggs and seeds.
And if your tests are successful, no doubt like us, you'll enjoy the results of some of your practical.